In the book of Matthew, the angel of God told Joseph to arise and take the young child Jesus, and flee into Egypt. He was told to stay there until he received further instructions, because Herod would seek the young child to destroy him. Matthew chapter 2, verse 13. And when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeareth to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, and take the young child and his mother, and flee into Egypt, and be thou there until I bring thee word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. Joseph was told to take his wife Mary and child Jesus, and flee into Egypt, not for military protection, because at that time, Egypt was a Roman province under Roman control. The only reason they fled into Egypt was because Egypt was still a black country, populated by a majority of black-skinned Egyptians. Joseph, Miriam, and Jesus would have been just another black-skinned family among many. Remember, they fled into Egypt to hide from Herod, who was seeking to kill baby Jesus. If Jesus and the rest of the Hebrews looked the way Christians and Hollywood portrays them, it would have been somewhat impossible for them to hide in Egypt, among the black Egyptians, and not be noticed. A biblical scholar by the name of Dr. Mark Goodacre, on a BBC program called The Complete Jesus produced in 2001, stated that, now it's very unlikely that Jesus would have been able to be hidden in Egypt, if he had a very different color of skin from the people in Egypt. Dr. Mark Goodacre also made mention of how the Israelites of the 1st to 3rd centuries wore their hair in afros, and wore short cropped black beards. During that time, Egypt was under Roman dominion and Herod was put on the throne of Israel by the Romans. All Herod had to do was check with the Roman officials in Egypt to find out if there were any Hebrews with baby boys around. But, since the Hebrews and the Egyptians had the same physical appearance, it would have been hard to single out a Hebrew family among the black ancient Egyptians. For further proof of the color of the ancient Israelites, let's look at Acts chapter 13, verse 1. Now there were in the church that was at Antioch certain prophets and teachers, as Barnabas, and Simeon that was called Niger, and Lucius of Cyrene, and Manaen, which had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. Simeon was one of the prophets and teachers at an Israelite congregation in Antioch. He was called a Niger by people in that area. According to Strong's exhaustive concordance, the word Niger is a Latin word that means black. Simon was not called Niger because he was the only black-skinned person there. On the contrary, it was because his hue was darker than the rest of the prophets and teachers. Much like in most Bantu communities, when one of the brothers or sisters have a skin tone that is darker than the rest, they sometimes give that person a nickname, like Nigger or Blackie, to describe his skin color. This is why Simeon was called Nigger or Black. Lucius is another prophet and teacher mentioned along with Simeon, and according to Acts chapter 13 verse 1, he was from Cyrene. Cyrene is a city in Libya, which is located in North Africa. Historians and scholars both agree that the city of Cyrene was a black area, meaning it was heavily populated with black-skinned people in biblical times. Matthew chapter 27, verse 32. And as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name, him they compelled to bear his cross. Cyrene is also the place where Simon, the man who helped Jesus carry the stake, was from. Many acknowledge that Simon, the stake-bearer, was a black man. It has been confirmed in the book of Acts that there were black-skinned men who were prophets and teachers at the assembly in Antioch, but, it must be understood that the Hebrews were not dealing with any other people or racial group at this time, other than scattered Israel. This is written in Acts chapter 11, verse 19. Now they which were scattered abroad upon the persecution that arose about Stephen travelled as far as Phoenice, and Cyprus, and Antioch, preaching the word to none but unto the Jews only. All these apostles were Hebrews, just like Paul, who was also there with them in the assembly in Antioch. Remember, Paul was mistaken for a black Egyptian. Mark chapter 15, verse 21. And they compel one Simon a Cyrenian, who passed by, coming out of the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. Romans chapter 16, verse 13. Salute Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother and mine. Simeon, who was called Niger, and Lucius were prophets and teachers, and as scripture shows us, all the prophets and teachers were Hebrews. Acts chapter 8, verse 26 to 36. And the angel of the Lord spake unto Philip, saying, Arise, and go toward the south unto the way that goeth down from Jerusalem unto Gaza, which is a desert. And he arose and went, and, behold, a man of Ethiopia, an eunuch of great authority under Candace queen of the Ethiopians, who had the charge of all her treasure, and had come to Jerusalem for to worship, was returning, and sitting in his chariot reading Isaiah the prophet. Then the Spirit said unto Philip, Go near, and join thyself to this chariot. And Philip ran thither to him, and heard him read the prophet Isaiah, and said, Understandest thou what thou readest? And he said, How can I, except some man should guide me? And he desired Philip that he would come up and sit with him. The place of the scripture which he read was this: He was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and like a lamb dumb before his shearer, so opened he not his mouth. In his humiliation his judgment was taken away, and who shall declare his generation? For his life is taken from the earth. And the eunuch answered Philip, and said, I pray thee, of whom speaketh the prophet this? Of himself, or of some other man? Then Philip opened his mouth, and began at the same scripture, and preached unto him Jesus. And as they went on their way, they came unto a certain water, and the eunuch said, See, here is water, what doth hinder me to be baptized? Let's analyze these verses in context. The Ethiopian eunuch was coming to Jerusalem to worship. In those days only the Hebrews went to Jerusalem for worship, because this is where the temple of God stood, making Jerusalem the spiritual home of all Israelites, as it is written in 2 Chronicles chapter 6 verse 6, and chapter 7 verse 6. The children of Israel continued to come to Jerusalem to worship, up until the time of the Roman destruction in AD 70. In fact, many Israelites were worshipping at the temple while the Romans were breaking down the walls of Jerusalem as they were about to lay siege to it. Essentially, this Ethiopian had Hebrew scriptures in his possession. In those days the scriptures were still considered sacred, and remained in the possession of the Israelites. Not everyone had access to scripture, as we do today. The children of Israel, whether abroad or in the land, were the primary owners of scripture in those days. The eunuch was baptized by Philip at last. All these verses prove that this Ethiopian eunuch was an Israelite, according to what Peter said in Acts chapter 10, verse 28. And he said unto them, Ye know how that it is an unlawful thing for a man that is a Jew to keep company, or come unto one of another nation. If the children of Israel thought it was unlawful to keep company with people of another nation, why would Philip go and keep company with this Ethiopian, if he was not an Israelite? Philip didn't even try to argue with the Spirit, when he was told to go and teach him. The truth is that the Ethiopian was an Israelite who lived in Ethiopia, making him one of what we call Ethiopian Jews today. This Israelite eunuch was not called Ethiopian just because he lived in Ethiopia, but because he also looked like a black-skinned native Ethiopian. To this very day, there are many black Israelites who live or have lived in Ethiopia in the past. Many of them are known as the Falasha or Beta Yisrael. Falasha means immigrant, in the language of the native Agau people of Ethiopia. It also means stranger in Amharic. They call themselves Beta Yisrael, which means House of Israel, and until recently they lived as a community in Ethiopia. In fact, they lived there for the past 3,000 years. This is probably where that Ethiopian Jew who Philip taught came from. The Falasha Jews also say that they are from the tribe of Dan. Acts chapter 18, verse 24. And a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man, and mighty in the scriptures, came to Ephesus. Apollos was an African-born Jew. Alexandria was in Egypt, Africa. Remember that when the Hebrews were in trouble or running from their enemies, they almost always fled to Africa in order to blend in among the black Egyptians, Ethiopians, and Libyans. This is because the Israelites were oftentimes mistaken for these Hamitic races. Clearly, Apollos, Rufus, Simeon, and the Ethiopian eunuch were scattered black Israelites living among the dark races of Africa. They and many other black Israelites living in Africa had the scriptures in their possession. This was long before the transatlantic slave trade. Contrary to popular belief, Africa and Arabia received the scriptures first, before Europe and Asia. The people that first brought the Bible to Africa were black. The Bible is definitely not a white man's book because it is very Afrocentric. Some people will try to argue that, if the original Hebrews were black, they didn't remain that way, because the Hebrews mixed with many different people. It is true that the Hebrews did some mixing with people of other nations, mainly due to the many captivities they suffered. But one thing to be noted is that, Israel had intermarriages with native Africans more than any other people, hence its racial makeup did not change. Many of the Hebrew patriarchs married or had children with women from the Egyptians, Ethiopians, Canaanites, and Libyans. Abraham had children with Hagar and Keturah, both from Hamitic tribes. Jacob had children with two handmaidens from Africa, and these children became the patriarchs of two tribes of Israel. Judah had sons with the Canaanite woman Shua. Joseph had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, with an Egyptian woman named Asenath. Moses married Zipporah, who was Ethiopian. The Hebrews very rarely interacted with Europeans other than through war. Black people have genes that carry dominant traits. Black hair, dark eyes, dark skin are dominant traits. Whereas light hair, light eyes, light skin are recessive traits. The recessive can come from the dominant, but the dominant traits cannot come from the recessive ones, or the lighter one can come from the darker one, but the darker cannot come from the lighter. This is a scientific fact, so if the Hebrews mixed with other people of lighter hues, the offspring would have come out looking like Hebrews with a bit lighter hue than the Hebrew parent. If they mixed with others of the same or darker hue, the offspring would have continued to look like the Hebrew Israelites. This is why the Egyptians ordered the Hebrew males to be killed and not the females, because the Egyptian males could impregnate the Hebrew females, and produce offspring which were still black, and still possessing the physical characteristics of the Egyptians. The descendants of Bantu slaves have mixed seed with the various racial groups of the Americas for over 400 years, but they are still known as a black people. They have mixed with various European, Indian, and Hispanic racial groups, and yet, their racial makeup has remained unchanged. One of the reasons for this is that Negro genes carry the dominant traits. Consider, for a moment, the children of mixed parents, one black parent and one white. The child will have more traits of the black parent than of the white one. The hair texture of the offspring, skin color, and facial features, will be closer to that of the black parent. Sometimes it's impossible to even tell that the offspring is of mixed parentage, because the child looks like conceived by two black parents.